Good morning, everyone, from Walterboro, Colleton County Courthouse, where Alex Murdaugh arrived just a short time ago for his sentencing after being found guilty on all counts last night in the case that has gone on for weeks now, facing those charges and now being found guilty of killing his wife and his son. Good morning, everybody. I'm Judy Gatson, along with Greg Adeline and our Nick Neville. Greg, I think it's sufficient to say there's still a little bit of shock in the atmosphere about how quickly this verdict came last night, Nick. We were all, of course, on standby, but as we sat and waited, everybody was playing kind of that waiting game. How long would it take for this jury to reach its verdict? And somebody made an astute observation saying that the jury, when they went in and started those deliberations at about 3:50 and it got to be 1 hour, 2 hour, they did not request dinner. So that gives you the implication that they got down, sat down, got to work, and knew they were going to be able to handle business within a reasonably short amount of time.
That's right. That verdict came quickly. It came within 3 hours, and there were rumblings and rumors that perhaps something was happening at the courthouse. As soon as we heard it, obviously we came out here, we saw people going into the courthouse, and it was at that point that we knew that a verdict was likely in this case. We saw the family show up here and also the defense attorneys showing up in very quick order. And after that, of course, that guilty verdict, guilty on all 4 counts.
Yes.
That was a stunning moment as you saw Alex Murdaugh standing emotionless as those verdicts were read. Today he showed up to court. We showed you that video just a little bit earlier. He showed up every single day as a defendant. This morning he shows up as a convicted murderer, the murderer of his wife and his son. And Judy, we have to talk about really what a victory this is for the Attorney General and for the state. Bringing forward this case, bringing a murder case and getting all of those convictions for Alex Murdaugh. When you think of the evidence in this case, it was exhaustive. There were 700 pieces of evidence, and there were 75 witnesses, and it was a trial that lasted for 5.5 weeks. So bringing that all together at times when many said perhaps the testimony got tedious at moments, but Alan Wilson and his team victorious in the end. Ultimately, what Alan Wilson, the Attorney General, even though he too went and questioned a witness, Ken Kenzie, right before basically the state's case wrapped up and the rebuttal witnesses, he was questioning Ken Kenzie to guide him through just what happened at Moselle June the 7th, 2021, rebutting all of the defense theories about 2 shooters and different shot trajectories. Alan Wilson himself picked up a rifle during that testimony and guided that jury through ultimately to seal a conviction. But really, when it came down to it, Attorney General Alan Wilson was speaking a little bit earlier on this morning, talking about what it took for his team to earn a conviction. He said that the biggest piece of evidence in all of this was Alex Murdaugh himself. Take a listen.
Nick, I'm just going to quickly...
Alex Murdaugh was our biggest piece of evidence when he took the stand. I think that was fatal for him ultimately. And obviously, he had created a web of lies for over a decade that led to this culminating point in this trial. Obviously, he had lied. He'd been lying his way out of things for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to tell the truth. We were prepared. When I signed his indictments on the double murder, I believe that we had the evidence to convict. Otherwise, I wouldn't have signed the indictments. But when he took the stand, that was basically, in my opinion, Alex had made a very successful career of giving closing arguments to juries and winning major cases and making a lot of money. This was his closing argument to the jury. I believe, in my mind, that he believed that he could talk his way out of this. And at the end of the day, I think it's what sealed it for him.
Again, that was Attorney General Alan Wilson on the Today Show this morning. The sentencing scheduled to start at 9:30, so we'll be here with you until that starts. But the moment Judge Newman starts those proceedings, we'll go inside. Nick, Attorney General Alan Wilson said basically Alex Murdaugh failed in his closing argument that he made to the jury, and Creighton Waters picked up on that as well yesterday.
Yes, he did. There for that press conference from Creighton Waters, the lead prosecutor. And so, of course, this was a big win for the state, for the Attorney General, but for Creighton Waters, the lead prosecuted any murder cases, Dick Harpootli in the past. So this was a big win. He talked last night about how this is a win for justice. Justice was done last night for Maggie and Paul, in his words. He also talked about, in many ways, this was the state's Super Bowl, because they were, together for 6 weeks. In many ways, this was like, they were back in college trying to, go through evidence and prepare late nights, long nights. But this was really, a critical time for them, a critical win for the state and for Creighton Waters, talking about how, it really doesn't matter your status, how much money you have, or you may say that you have. He basically said if you do wrong in the state of South Carolina, this shows that, you will be convicted. Listen to Creighton Waters tonight.
Justice was done today. It doesn't matter who your family is. It doesn't matter how much money you have or people think you have. It doesn't matter what you think, how prominent you are. If you do wrong, if you break the law, if you murder, then justice will be done in South Carolina. And I think South Carolina has shown to the nation and the world how a process can work and work well. Thank y'all.
Again, that was Creighton Waters just shortly after they got that guilty verdict against Alex Murdaugh tonight. And just to give everyone an idea of what to expect in the courtroom today, Greg, as you mentioned, he didn't show up in his shirt and tie or, with the jacket over those handcuffs this morning. He showed up in prison garb today. And so it'll be a much different scene in the courtroom. We are going to hear from witnesses. That is why Judge Newman delayed the sentencing last night. He said he expected that there are a number of witnesses, and we can talk more about that because you guys have covered it extensively in your coverage, who will want to speak to see if we will hear from members of Maggie's family. And that really was kind of set up this morning by the Attorney General on the Today Show as well, because he said that in the community, people have been talking with them, trying to wrap their minds around why someone would do this to any family member. And he said, people can think of stories where they've heard of one spouse killing another, but, when it comes to a parent killing a child. So let's take a listen to what A.G. Wilson had to say on the Today Show this morning about that motive. And then, again, we'll keep an eye on jury proceedings or the sentencing proceedings and talk more about the witnesses that we could hear from today. But take a listen.
People could understand a spouse killing another spouse, but the way that Paul and Maggie were murdered, his son, the brutality of it, people just had a hard time making that leap. But what you have is you have a family legacy that is over 100 years old. You have a man that has lived a lifestyle of privilege in a world that many of us will never know. And all of that was going to end eventually, and he was getting desperate. He was in survivor mode at this point. And that was always a state's theory, that this guy wasn't just about money. People say, he wasn't just killing his wife and son because of the money he wasn't making. It was everything. It was an entire lifestyle and a lifetime that was going to come to an end.
Of the state's argument for motive, and really they had to thread a needle throughout this trial because, after all, you can't bring in certain character evidence into a trial if that evidence doesn't pertain correct or exactly to the crime itself. You can't bring in all this extra character evidence. However, it did in some ways seep into this trial throughout all of the different circumstances, whether it was the roadside shooting, whether it was the final crimes. All of that kind of made their way in, but really some of the most compelling character evidence came from people in Alex Murdaugh's orbit, some of his friends, some of his law partners. Ronnie Crosby comes to mind, Chris Wilson comes to mind, but really it was the family of Maggie Murdaugh, as you mentioned. Picking up on that, Marion Proctor, when she took the stand, was perhaps one of the most powerful witnesses. It's Maggie's sister.
Yes.
She was able to give a picture and a portrait of Alex Murdaugh as someone who wasn't necessarily concerned about finding the killers in the aftermath of this. She said that he seemed more concerned about the boat case. She said there were certain things that just simply seemed off. She said that she had asked Alex, who do you feel might have done this? And Alex Murdaugh turned to her and said, well, whoever did it thought about it for a really long time. Very powerful. That testimony was relayed in the courtroom. And really, when you think about that, it kind of pertains to malice in this case. And that was one of the things that prosecutors in their closing argument said was a big component, because it showed forethought by Alex Murdaugh to carry out these crimes. So Marion Proctor, I felt, was just an incredible witness. Curious as to whether or not we're going to hear from her today. When it comes to some of these witnesses, honestly, I think many people are expecting a life sentence for both of these murders.
On both charges.
Yes, on both charges, only because Newman last night, even from the bench. So that tips the hand a little bit there, and really there's so much in terms of that evidence of Alex Murdaugh lying and planning and fooling everybody. And we're going to hear a little bit about that right now in a soundbite. But it was just that whole idea that this was carried on for so long.
Yeah.
And so ultimately,
a web of lies.
Yes,
Yeah.
that just carries so much weight as we head into the sentencing. Take a listen.
The second that you're confronted with facts that you can't deny, you immediately come up with a new lie. Isn't that correct?
Mr. Waters, as we've established, I have lied many times, but I can't sit here and tell you that. What are you talking about? Facts that I can't deny? That I would disagree with that proposition that you're putting out. That was what I did all the time. But in doing that, I admit again that I've lied to people that trusted me.
And I tell you what, as you listen and as we recall, Nick, how many times Alex Murdaugh admitted on the stand that he did in fact lie. When we think about the whole concept of beyond reasonable doubt, had he not taken the stand, there might have been at least one juror who said, you know, the evidence videos, you know, of those interviews, you could find some justification, just overwhelmed grief, the opioid addiction and all these things. There might have been one juror who could reasonable doubt, but when he got on the stand, he erased it.
Yeah, and that was absolutely one of the key points that Creighton Waters tried to make in his questioning of Murdaugh, basically getting him to admit dozens and dozens of times, did you lie to this person, did you lie to that person, people that you loved, people that you were close to, your law partners, and of course the big lie was the lie that he was never at the crime scene just minutes before the murders, the dog kennels. He tried to explain that away basically by saying he was paranoid due to his addiction, and also he had a distrust of SLED. But in the end, jurors basically found Alex Murdaugh to not essentially be a credible witness due to all of those lies. And one of the things, Judy, that's going to be interesting to see, Greg, you talked about Marion Proctor. When she took the stand, we really at that point had not heard from Maggie Murdaugh's family at all since the murders. And so it'll be interesting to see today if we hear from her parents at all. I think that's something that'll be interesting. Also, it's been fascinating to watch Judge Newman through all of this in many of his different rulings. One of the key ones, of course, was allowing in all of the financial crimes evidence. And Greg, that speaks to this idea of motive that you were talking about, because it was unclear at the beginning of this trial, and that was something that Creighton Waters tried to toe that line in his opening statement, because he couldn't really touch on some of this motive as it pertained to the financial crimes, because it was unclear how much of that would be allowed in. But last night, what was really fascinating to watch was after the verdict came down, Judge Newman really sort of laid into Murdaugh and said there was just overwhelming evidence, circumstantial and otherwise, essentially saying that he believes that the jurors here got it right. Let's take a listen, Judge Newman last night.
Circumstantial evidence, direct evidence, all of the evidence pointed to only one conclusion. That's the conclusion that you all reached. So I applaud you all for, as a group and as a unit and individually, evaluating the evidence and coming to a proper conclusion as you saw the law, as you saw the facts.
We understand that the pool camera in the courtroom has zoomed out that Judge Newman is moving to the courtroom, so as soon as those proceedings start, we will go inside live. But Greg, again, the big question today is, will we hear from Maggie's family? And as I thought about that, I wondered, you know how many people they had on the stand who testified that the first time that they learned that Alex lied about being at the kennels and was in fact there was when he took the stand. Imagine if that was also the case for Maggie's family.
It may have been, and we will see if they'll take the stand today as we listen into that sentencing.
Your Honor,
Very quickly, the defendant has no prior record, and the state has no victim impact people who want to speak at this time. But I will address the court briefly. And I don't need Your Honor to repeat the evidence that Your Honor just heard for the past 6 weeks, but it is overwhelming, and it shows this man to be a cunning manipulator, a man who placed himself above all others, including his family, a man who violated the trust of so many, including his friends, his family, his partners, his profession, but most of all, Maggie and Paul. This is a very complicated situation, and I want to offer my condolences to the family that has suffered here. We have tried very hard to be respectful and sensitive regardless of what position any person took, because this family has suffered, and they've had to suffer in the public eye. And I want to offer my condolences to this family. I want to offer it for Maggie and Paul and Mr. Randolph, too, who I had the pleasure of working with on one occasion. But the reality remains is that despite all this attention, this case is about Maggie Murdaugh and Paul Murdaugh, and I'm so thankful that the jurors gave them a voice. You heard about Paul. Obviously, there was the boat case, but you also heard him described as a fun-loving young man, friends for anyone. And he's cut down, he's just starting to live his life. You heard about Maggie. You heard how she was a girl's girl who adapted to the life of her sons, how much she loved her sister and her brother-in-law and their children, and she was cut down. Both of them, like everyone else, was unaware of who he really was. No one who thought they were who he really was. And Your Honor, that's chilling. And I've looked in his eyes, and he liked to stare me down as he would walk by me during this trial. And I could see the real Alex looked at me. The depravity, the callousness, the selfishness of these crimes are stunning. The lack of remorse and the effortless way in which he lies, including here sitting right over there in this witness stand. Your Honor, a man like that, a man like this man, should never be allowed to be among free, law-abiding citizens again. And I would submit to you that the only just sentence here to give justice for Maggie and Paul is the maximum, and that would be 2 consecutive life sentences. Thank you, Your Honor.
You indicate that no victim would like to speak at this time. Would any victim like to speak at any time during these proceedings?
Your Honor, one of the things we did, and we did early on, obviously, as I just said, it's a very complicated situation, but we made the decision early on. We've had our victim advocate here who's been doing a wonderful job, regardless of the viewpoints of any individual family member, to provide aid and service to them, and we made that decision. I'm informed by our victim advocate that none of them wish to speak. The defense can certainly address that, but that's what I am informed. But they certainly were offered the opportunity as is required, and I want to commend our victim advocate on the excellent job she did in handling this complex situation that we wanted to be sensitive to, because again, none of us are not mindful of the fact of the suffering of this family.
I noticed Sled Chief Mark Keel is here. Would you like to address the court on any matters, Chief?
No, sir. Just to say again, very proud of our agents, the work they've done. I'm proud of the partnership that we've had with the Attorney General's office as we've had for many years. And again, we're here to see the justice is served, and we believe it has been.
Thank you. For the defense.
Your Honor, Mr. Griffin and I would have no comment. The defendant would like to address the court, though.
Mr. Murdaugh.
Good morning, Your Honor. I'm innocent. I would never hurt my wife, Maggie, and I would never hurt my son, Paw Paw.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Anything further?
I don't think further comment is necessary, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Murdaugh, if you'll come before the court for sentencing. This has been perhaps one of the most troubling cases, not just for me as a judge, for the state, for the defense team, but for all of the citizens in this community, all the citizens in this state, and as we've seen based on the media coverage throughout the nation. You have a wife who's been killed, murdered, a son savagely murdered, a lawyer, a person from a respected family who has controlled justice in this community for over a century, a person whose grandfather's portrait hang at the back of the courthouse that I had to have ordered removed in order to ensure that a fair trial was had by both the state and the defense. And I've sat through the trial. Not only have I sat through the trial, but also as the presiding judge of the state grand jury, sat through and participated in the issuance of search warrants of various sorts, bond hearings, and have had to consider many things. And we have this case, and I'm also assigned to preside over 99 others, at least 99 other cases. Though testimony has come up regarding many of those other cases, I will not make any comment with regard to any other pending matter, as I have been assigned those cases as well. It's also particularly troubling, Mr. Murdaugh, because as a member of the legal community and a well-known member of the legal community, you've practiced law before me, and we've seen each other at various occasions throughout the years. And it was especially heartbreaking for me to see you go in the media from being a grieving father who lost a wife and a son to being the person indicted and convicted of killing them. And you've engaged in such duplicitous conduct here in the courtroom, here on the witness stand, and as established by the testimony throughout the time leading from the time of the indictment and prior to the indictment throughout the trial to this moment in time. Certainly, you have no obligation to say anything other than saying not guilty. And obviously, as appeals are probably expected or absolutely expected, I would not expect a confession of any kind. In fact, as I've presided over murder cases over the past 22 years, I have yet to find a defendant who could go there, who could go back to that moment in time when they decided to pull the trigger or to otherwise murder someone. I have not been able to get anyone, any defendant, even those who have confessed to being guilty, to go back and explain to me what happened at that moment in time when they opted to pull the trigger, when they opted to commit the most heinous crimes known to man. In this case, qualifies under our death penalty statute based on the statutory aggravating circumstances of two or more people being murdered by the defendant by one act or pursuant to one scheme or course of conduct. I don't question at all the decision of the state not to pursue the death penalty. But as I sit here in this courtroom and look around the many portraits of judges and other court officials and reflect on the fact that over the past century, your family, including you, have been prosecuting people here in this courtroom, and many have received the death penalty, probably for lesser conduct. Remind me of the expression you gave on the witness stand. Was it tangled?
Tangled web, we weave.
Oh, what tangled web we weave. What did you mean by that?
It meant when I lied, I continue to lie.
And the question is, when will it end? When will it end? And it's ended already for the jury because they've concluded that you continued to lie and lied throughout your testimony. And perhaps with all the throng of people here, they, for the most part, all believe, or 80, 90%, 99% believe that you continue to lie now when your statement of denial to the court. Perhaps you believe that it does not matter, that there's nothing that can mitigate a sentence given the crimes that were committed. You know, a notice of alibi was filed in this case by counsel in November, and we conducted a hearing, pretrial hearing, in which you claimed to have been someplace else at the time the crime was committed. Then, after all of the witnesses placed you at the scene of the crime, at the last minute, or last minutes or days, you switch courses and admitted to being there. And then that necessitated more lies and continued to lie. And And I said, where will it end? It's already ended for many who have heard you and concluded that it'll never end. But within your own soul, you have to deal with that. And I know you have to see Paul and Maggie during the night times when you're attempting to go to sleep. I'm sure they come and visit you. I'm sure.
All day and every night.
Yeah, I'm sure. And they will continue to do so. And reflect on the last time they looked you in the eyes, as you looked the jury in the eyes. I don't know person who's always been such a gregarious, friendly person and cause your life to be tangled in such a web, such a situation that yours have spun into, and it's so unfortunate because you had such a lovely family of such friendly people, including you, and to go from that to this. You know, your license to practice law has been stripped away from you. You turned from lawyer to witness, and now have an opportunity to make your final appeal as an ex-lawyer. And it's almost, it's really surprising that you're waiving this right at this time. And if you opt to do so, it's on you. You're not compelled to say anything. But you have the opportunity to do so.
Judge, I tell you again, I respect this court, but I'm innocent. I would never, under any circumstances, hurt my wife, Maggie, and I would never, under any circumstances, hurt my son, Paul.
Well, and it might not have been you. It might have been the monster you become when you take 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 opioid pills. Maybe you become another person. I've seen that before. The person standing before me was not the person who committed the crime, though it's the same individual. We'll leave that at that. Before announcing sentence on these cases, with regard to all of the other pending cases, are any of them here in Colleton, or I'm sure some of them are?
Yes, sir.
Half of them, or?
I don't have that in front of me, but there are a substantial number of charges here. There's some in Hampton, Orangeburg, Beaufort, Allendale. There may be others that I'm not thinking of right now.
We might have worn out our welcome here in Colleton. They have been, and I'll take this opportunity to thank Sheriff Hill and all of the court officials and really everyone I've met and dealt with while here in Colleton County. Just been great. But without any delay, we're going to schedule some of the other matters. I know Mr. Harpootlian's scheduling is complicated, and you've sacrificed quite a bit to be able to be here defending Mr. Murdaugh, as well as the Attorney General's office, with all the other many, many things and obligations you have. And to be able to have the Attorney General here, Alan Wilson, for the period of time that he's devoted to being here along with everyone else, it's been quite a sacrifice but there are other victims whose cases deserve to be heard. And this case has jumped some of those other cases, perhaps jumped it because of this case resulting in an assault on the integrity of the judicial system in our state, law enforcement in our state. Even during this trial, the law enforcement have been maligned for the past 5 or 6 weeks by one who had access to the wheels of justice, to be able to deflect the investigation. And as the evidence is pointed out in this case, the looming storm that Mr. Waters talked about, I can just imagine on that day, June 7th, when a lawyer is confronted and confesses to having stolen over $500,000 from a client, and he has a tiger like Mark Tinsley on his tail pursuing discovery in the case involving the death of Mallory Beach, and having a father, for the most part, on his deathbed. I could imagine, or really can't imagine, but I know it had to have been quite a bit going through your mind on that day. But amazingly, to have you come and testify that it was just another ordinary day, that my wife and son and I were out just enjoying life. Not credible, not believable. You can convince yourself about it, but obviously you have the inability to convince anyone else about that. So if you made any such arguments as a lawyer, you would lose every case like that. Cases you will never have an opportunity to argue anymore, except perhaps your own as you sit in the Department of Corrections. Anything further?
No, sir.
All right, Mr. Murdaugh, I sentence you to the State Department of Corrections on each of the murder indictments in the murder of your wife, Maggie Murdaugh. I sentence you for the term of the rest of your natural life for the murder of Paul Murdaugh, whom you probably loved so much. I sentence you to prison for murdering him for the rest of your natural life. Those sentences will run consecutive. Under the statute involving possession of a weapon during a violent crime, there is no sentence where a life sentence is imposed on other indictments. That is the sentence of the court, and you are remanded to the State Department of Corrections. And officers may carry forth on the imposition. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
coverage where Judge Newman has just, Greg, I don't quite know the words to describe it, but he did not spare any of his disbelief and shock and admonishment for Alex Murdaugh, talking to him about the savage murders of his wife and son, sentencing him to the rest of his natural life in prison. We've got Carl B. Grant, trial attorney, here with us. Nick Neville is here with us as well. But I just want to give our viewers some insight about what Judge said. He said that your family has controlled this county, this courthouse, for more than a century. This courthouse where they had to have the portraits removed of his family, and where Murdaugh himself has practiced law before Judge Newman. And Murdaugh stood before the judge this morning and told him again, I did not commit these murders, that I would never do anything to hurt my wife Maggie or my son Paw. And Judge Newman replied to him and said, well, maybe it wasn't you, but the monster you have become.
That's right. He denied it twice. And Judge Newman, in his sentencing, said that when it comes to Murdaugh's prosecutorial background, his family background, how those pictures were up in the courtroom.
Yes.
He says, as I look around this courtroom, I think that there were definitely defendants who got sentenced to death for lesser crimes than what you've committed.
He sure did.
I mean, he really laid into Alex Murdaugh many times, and just in an eloquent way, just kind of talking about the person that Alex Murdaugh had become. As you mentioned, just talking about how perhaps, in Newman's estimation, that maybe it was drugs that caused him to do that night, but still he believed that he did it nonetheless. Newman saying that he could not believe amount of duplicitous conduct, as he described it, from Alex Murdaugh on the stand and throughout the trial, even to this moment, saying that he could just turn on and off the type of person that he really was from who he was portraying himself in public to be. So he talked about just the general nature of Alex Murdaugh and a type of evil that existed that Judge Newman spoke to, and stated that he saw no other option but to give 2 life sentences for the murders of Maggie and Paul.
And as we bring Carl in, Judge Newman said something else that I found to be very compelling. And we've talked a little bit about it, but he put it in such a compelling way. Carl, he talked about the fact that he has faced many murder defendants over the years, and that he has never been able, even the ones who confessed to the crimes, even to the ones who admitted their guilt, he has never found a defendant who could explain to him what came over them in that moment when they decided to pull the trigger. Just incredible to see this play out. But Judge Newman, you know a lot about his history, especially when it comes to trying cases like this.
Well, what the judge is looking for is somebody who's willing to accept responsibility. But here's the dichotomous nature of that decision. If you still have an appeal in front of you, you cannot accept responsibility and admit guilt for something that you said you're not guilty of. Obviously, that will be problematic with your appeal. Judge Newman is a very serious judge. He is a very fair man, but he's known in criminal defense as a hard sentencer. Judge Newman is the type of guy that if you're convicted and you have this type of crime that you're convicted of, in all probability, you probably would get life in prison. I know of a situation where a person was facing and he pled guilty in front of judge. The death penalty was still on the table, meaning the judge could have decided if he wanted to do life without parole or the death penalty. And the judge, in his wisdom and his discretion, decided to sentence the man to death. That was his right and ability as the judge. But the point I'm making is he is a no-nonsense kind of fellow. And when it comes to mercy, I think I've heard him say himself, he is the wrong person to seek mercy from, because he'll give you the type of mercy that you showed the victim.
Yeah, and Carl, you know, he really laid into Alex Murdaugh, talking about all of his lies and just the pattern of lies, and asking that question over and over, when will it end? You know, even when given the chance, even today, to say and to admit that he committed these crimes, Alex Murdaugh would not. Denying it. And so Judge Newman, just seeing this obstinance and this unwillingness to come to the truth that the jury decided in this case.
Because he didn't have to say anything today.
He did not.
The judge was surprised he waived his right.
That's right. And he still denied it emphatically, saying that he'd never do anything to hurt his wife or his son. But really, Judge Newman kind of laying out throughout the trial how Alex Murdaugh lied repeatedly, and only when that kennel video placed him at the scene of the crimes did he ever come clean. And then he said something that I thought was powerful, even chilling. He said, "I know that Maggie and Paul Murdaugh visit you in your dreams every night." And to that point, Alex Murdaugh said, "all day and every night." And what Judge Newman said was that will haunt him for the rest of his days as he sits in a prison here in the state of South Carolina, a place, down here in the Lowcountry where his family is. Hard to fathom that in a short span of a year and a half, that all of that crumbled because of the action of one man.
Carl, let me ask you about this, and for those who may have missed some of the judge's comments in the courtroom, we'll have some of that for you in just a moment. But you mentioned appeal, and that perhaps that's the reason to try and preserve his appeal, or to proffer a stronger appeal, that he is still maintaining his innocence. But isn't his opportunity for an appeal weakened by the fact that he got on the stand in the case and told more lies?
It is weakened to that extent. However, there are legal issues as for evidence that came in. All of the objections made by the defense attorneys, preserving those objections for appeal. And that's why it is so important for a defense attorney not to sit on his hands, but to be alert and aware and to make a timely objection to the evidence. And they did that, and they objected and challenged the evidence. So when they did that, they preserved it for appeal.
Listen, our Nick Neville is standing by. If he is ready, Nick, I know you listened into Judge Newman's comments, and he talked about the conduct. Okay, so we don't have Nick just yet. I thought Nick was standing by. We're waiting for the news conference from the prosecutor. Well, the news conference that's the defense attorneys. They said they're going to an hour after the sentencing wraps up. So checking time, it's about 10:14. So we'll have that about 11:14. But let's go ahead and listen to Judge Newman. He talked about that duplicitous conduct. Here, listen to what he had to say.
And you've engaged in such duplicitous conduct here in the courtroom, here on the witness stand, and as established by the testimony throughout the time leading from the time of the indictment and prior to the indictment throughout the trial to this moment in time. Certainly, you have no obligation to say anything other than saying not guilty. And obviously, as appeals are probably expected or absolutely expected, I would not expect a confession of any kind. In fact, as I've presided over murder cases over the past 22 years, I have yet to find a defendant who could go there, who could go back to that moment in time when they decided to pull the trigger or to otherwise murder someone. I have not been able to get anyone, any defendant, even those who have confessed to being guilty, to go back and explain to me what happened at that moment in time when they opted to pull the trigger.
Very powerful. And you know, one of the things that he said right before he sentenced him to 2 life sentences was he talked about perhaps what was most compelling to Judge Newman when it came to the date, June the 7th, 2021, talking about the circumstances in Alex Murdaugh's life. He said that he had Mark Tinsley, an attorney in the Mallory Beach boat case, chasing him like a tiger by its tail, was how he described it.
Sure did.
Said that his father was on his deathbed. Of course, there were the legal fees, $792,000 at PMPED. Jeannie Seckinger pressed him on that day. And Judge Newman said that when Alex Murdaugh testified, he said it was just like another day. And Newman said that he did not buy that in the least. He said, you might have been able to convince you, but you couldn't convince me. That was powerful, because at the time in that testimony, you heard Alex Murdaugh just kind of dismiss it, to just be like, you know, it didn't bother me too much. He sought to swat it away. Yeah. One person was watching that. That was Judge Newman.
Yes.
And he turned it on him and gave him 2 life sentences.
He did. And last night when Judge Newman spoke to this jury, even though he deferred sentencing until this morning, Carl, he assured the jury that based on the evidence, circumstantial and direct, that they had made the right decision based on the evidence that had been presented to them. And this morning, Judge Newman made a point of saying he does not question the state's decision to take the death penalty off the table.
Right.
But a life sentence, I mean, he sentenced him to the rest of his natural life. So what does that mean?
Well, that means this. He will have to serve every day for the next day of his life in prison. He gets out of jail in a coffin. It's not like the old law. In the old law, if you were sentenced to life in prison, you'd spend about 20 years, maybe 25. You're eligible for parole. I know people who actually were given life sentences and they're free now, walking around just as free as everybody else. But not today's law. If you get life in prison, it's truly life. Life means life. Now here's the thing. The judge could have given him 50 years in prison if he wanted to. And if he did, he would have to serve those day per day, which would technically be life anyhow considering his age. But he decided to make a point and give him life without parole. Now, it's my understanding he gave him 2 life sentences, correct?
Yes, that was my understanding as well.
Yes.
Were they? Okay, I was going to say, we were getting ready for the live shot, listening into Judge Newman, and Greg, you made reference to some very personal comments that Judge Newman made to him, because he talked to Alex Murdaugh about the fact that Murdaugh has tried cases before Judge Newman. Over the years, they have seen each other at different events. I mean, the law community in the state of South Carolina, relatively small. That moment that Greg referenced earlier about Judge Newman talking to Alex Murdaugh about his wife and his son visiting him in his dreams, take a listen to that now.
And I know you have to see Paul and Maggie during the night times when you're attempting to go to sleep. I'm sure they come and visit you. I'm sure.
All day and every night.
Yeah, I'm sure. And they will continue to do so. And reflect on the last time they looked you in the eyes.
Very powerful moment there, and we were talking about these consecutive life sentences here that Alex Murdaugh will face, and really an inability that he had to reconcile himself, Newman said, with the truth, to be able to come to grips with it, asking, when will this end? Well, Judge Newman said that you'll have the rest of your natural-born life to litigate that case to yourself behind bars.
At the Department of Corrections, he sure did.
Yes, and the thing about it, the question becomes, well, if you get out when you die, why would you give him 2 consecutive life sentences?
Right.
Here's the point. The reason why the judge did that is to at least to give some measure of justice to each individual, each victim. I've actually seen a judge give 3 consecutive life sentences when each sentence required life without parole. So that can happen. That's the reason why judges do that.
And we have heard so much about the lies that Alex Murdaugh told. And, you know, Carl, as a matter of legal proceeding, a case often is not about what he said and what she said. It's about what you can present as evidence, what you are allowed to admit.
Yes.
And I think about one moment when Alex Murdaugh was caught in that lie about putting those blue lights on his personal vehicle. The only reason they were able to bring that police chief in to refute that was because Alex opened the door, as you attorneys like to say.
That's right.
But otherwise, we might not have never known that. But Alex Murdaugh did that.
He sure did.
I mean, we talked earlier about the fact that, you know, just looking at the videos that were put into evidence alone,
yes,
it might have been expected that at least one juror may have found a way to say, you know what, he was just overwhelmed with grief, and to be able to dismiss those misstatements, lies, you know, depending on who you talk to and how they want to characterize them. But when he took the stand, I mean, in many ways, he erased any reasonable doubt.
He did, and it goes back to the demeanor of the witnesses and everything too. And we must consider the context in which that testimony came in. The context of that testimony coming in about the blue lights was to depict him as a man who has authority but abuses that authority. Let's remember the badge on the hip bone there when he went to the hospital, flashing that badge. So the purpose of that testimony and revelation is for the jury to see we're dealing with a man now who had authority, he abused that authority, he was a lawyer, he knows, as they put it, he knows how to tell a good story, and he was spinning. You asked me the question, I'm going to repeat the question before I give you an answer. That's called spinning, and that's exactly what he was doing. And the jury picked up on that and decided he was not credible.
Yeah, and you know, there's another point in Judge Newman's, before he sentenced Alex Murdaugh, where he was talking about those lies and how, when Alex Murdaugh started to lie, he turned his testimony on him. He said when you lied, you had to continue to lie. And even turned the words on Alex Murdaugh and said, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave." Yes. He says, "Was that not what you said?" And I thought another thing was interesting when they were talking about the opioid abuse and the opioid use. You saw how at different points in the trial, Alex Murdaugh used opioids as an excuse. Well, they established this throughout, even the closing argument and now into the sentencing, that intoxication by chemicals, whether alcohol, drugs, anything like that, is no excuse.
And it's not a defense.
It's not a defense.
No,
it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so he said that maybe it was 20, 30, 40, 50 pills, whatever you took that night. Who knows what it took to ultimately make you make that decision, but that was a choice that you made nonetheless.
Yes, sir. The law says voluntary intoxication is not a defense to committing a crime.
And let's take a listen to what Judge Newman had to say about that, because he talked to Alex Murdaugh specifically about the lie that he told, that critical lie about not being at the kennel and what it took to force him to tell the truth. Take a listen to what Judge Newman had to say about Alex Murdaugh's fabricated alibi.
Notice of alibi was filed in this case by counsel in November, and we conducted a hearing, pretrial hearing, in which you claimed to have been someplace else at the time the crime was committed. And then, after all of the witnesses placed you at the scene of the crime, at the last minute, or last minutes or days, you switch courses and admitted to being there. And then that necessitated more lies and continued to lie. And I say, where will it end? It's already ended for many who have heard you and concluded that it'll never end. But within your own soul, you have to deal with that.
One thing that Judge Newman also described was just how in those final moments, and I thought this was very powerful as well, and it was something that Creighton Waters talked about time and time again in his closing argument about Alex Murdaugh looking people in the eye, saying that he would look his victims in the eye, financial crimes, and just lie to them right behind their backs. And Creighton Waters also said that Alex Murdaugh looked the jurors in the eye.
Yes.
And Judge Newman picked up on that theme today in the sentencing and said, Alex, you looked your wife and son in the eye and committed these crimes. And that was powerful, just a powerful image there in saying, Alex Murdaugh he said you had a lovely family, a family that everyone loved to be around. He said that he had history with Alex Murdaugh, that Judge Newman knew Alex Murdaugh, saw him try cases, knew him from different functions on the side, and said everything on the outside looked to be so good, but really underneath it all, he says that Judge Newman even struggling to come to grips with the monster that Alex Murdaugh became. Listen to that.
I respect this court, but I'm innocent. I would never, under any circumstances, hurt my wife, Maggie, and I would never, under any circumstances, hurt my son, Paw.
Well, and it might not have been you. It might have been the monster you become when you take 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 opioid pills. maybe you become another person. I've seen that before.
And so we want to start looking ahead to what is coming next following the sentencing. Carl, you've explained that life means life for him, that he'll spend the rest of his natural life in prison. But there are other open cases, and Judge Newman made reference to that today, that he has been assigned to other cases. I think he said at least 99, right?
That's right,
and
financial
that
crimes, other victims
Other
as well.
victims, exactly, Greg. And so Judge Newman made a point of saying he would not comment on those cases today, but certainly, Greg, everything that Alex Murdaugh has said and confessed to in this trial will be admissible in those cases, will it not?
Absolutely. And here's the thing. Those are the charges and the cases that he was pretty much confessing to on the witness stand with the so what kind of attitude. Yes,
Which
I might
he previously pled not guilty to.
Exactly.
Yes.
I might be, he might be a thief, a liar, and all that, but I'm not a murderer.
Yeah.
So he's essentially already admitted to all of the elements for those crimes. So honestly, I don't ever see those cases going to trial. That would be an exercise in futility, considering the record that they already have of everything he said. Yeah, everything he said in court in this trial.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so other victims as well, Judge Newman mentioning the family of Mallory Beach, also, the family of Gloria Satterfield.
Yes.
Still waiting for some answers in that. Certainly they got a settlement, but, other people are calling for perhaps more investigation into what happened there.
But you know what, Greg? When Harpootlian made a comment about the Satterfields being made whole in this news conference, or not the news conference, but in the court proceedings, and he made some reference to, you've been made whole, people took offense to that.
They certainly did.
Their mother is dead.
They certainly did.
What do you, it came across as just, it did not serve his client well. I'll just leave it at that.
Julie, actually, I think he actually said, you've been made more than whole.
More than whole.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly
which is really offensive.
It is indeed. On that note, let me share some breaking news with you. I've just learned from the defense team they are planning to hold their news conference at 11:45. Last night they indicated it would be 1 hour after the judge delivered and completed the sentencing. So it looks like that's been pushed back a little bit because it's 10:30 right now, 10:29 right now. So it will be 11:45. So we'll be on air a little early for our midday news conference, but 11:45 as promised, and throughout the trial we'll have that for you live as we continue to have reaction to this stunning verdict finding Alex Murdaugh guilty on all charges.
A couple of final impressions, just a strong rebuke from Judge Newman as he really laid into Alex Murdaugh and talked about his duplicitous nature and all of those lies, and he did not hold back.
No.
This was very sobering in many ways to hear 2 life sentences there. And of course, the search for justice will continue in so many of these other cases. As we mentioned, there's other victims out there that are still, I will say one powerful moment from earlier through this trial. There was a moment where Stephen Smith's mother showed up here, and she's still looking for answers as well. And there's a lot of people calling for justice there. That investigation has been reopened. There's no firm answers for now, and many are hoping that she will find those answers too. A lot of people in this orbit of this who probably felt a sense of vindication in what happened yesterday.
Absolutely. And I know some people were surprised that we really didn't hear. They were wondering, especially after Judge Newman's comments last night, wanting to make sure that any victim who wanted to speak out could speak out. We thought we might hear a lot of testimony this morning, but we did not. And the state really kind of indicated that they feel as though they have gotten justice through the way we have prosecuted this case.
And the convictions spoke for themselves.
They did indeed. That is it for now for our live coverage. Again, the defense is expected to hold a news conference at 11:45 a.m. Our Nick Neville, a part of our live team coverage here as well. We will be standing by whenever that news conference happens. We will have it live for you here on air and on WISTV.com. So look ahead to a special edition of WIS Newsday starting early today with that news conference from the defense and more reaction again to the stunning verdict. Alex Murdaugh found guilty on all charges.
Stop raising Gen Z teens. What's your ruling, Wanda?
Oh, my ruling is, boy, you need a lot of